Matthew Dodder is the executive director of the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. He began his lifelong study of birds in 1977 as a boy in Boston. He's traveled widely in search of exotic species. He enjoys birding everywhere, especially in California, where the coasts, mountains, deserts, and grasslands offer a spectacular variety of birds, including some found nowhere else in the world. His passions also include drawing, design, and cooking. Before taking his current position at Audubon, he taught birding at the Palo Alto Adult School for more than 20 years, where he learned firsthand how much joy the study of birds can awaken in students. And the drawings on these PowerPoint presentation are by Matthew himself. So welcome, Matthew. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me share my screen. I'm Matthew Dodder, the Executive Director of Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. And for the last 45 years, I spent a lot of time thinking about, learning about, and admiring birds. And after many missteps, I finally found a career where that interest is an asset. One of the most intriguing parts about the study of birds is migration. It's important to ask, what is migration? Because not everybody understands what that is. At its core, it's a very simple thing. It's the seasonal movement of animals from one region to another. What motivates them to go from one region to another, or the timing that they use, is different depending on what you're talking about, who you're talking about. We see migration in the insect world with monarch butterflies, most famously migrating from Mexico to Canada in a multi-generational journey, which is a stupendous story. We see migration in amphibians like the California newt, which we have locally here in Northern California, migrating from the drier hills to the lower wetlands where they lay their eggs. We see migration in fish, the Pacific salmon, another famous example, migrating from the ocean to the shallow rocky beds of small creeks where they spawn. And we see it in huge marine mammals like the humpback whales. So humpback whales exist in the Arctic and Antarctic, and they spend their calving season migrating to the tropics. Now, from the very large to the very small, we see migration happening on a daily basis with zooplankton, which come to the surface of the ocean in the dark hours of the day, after which, when the sun comes up, they descend into the dark depths. So this represents the largest migration of any life form on the planet, outweighing even the largest of the marine mammals by many orders of magnitude. But we're really going to be speaking about birds specifically. And it is, in fact, the way many of us mark our seasons. Poets write about migration, birders admire it and watch it and anticipate it, and the general public is conscious of it as well. But migration has been misunderstood for centuries. Take, for example, one of our swallows in North America, the cliff swallow, which is very much like some swallows in Europe, where this anecdote actually comes from. But the cliff swallow arrives in spring, sort of magically. It migrates at night, and it appears in the morning, immediately gathering mud in order to make its mud nests. Now, the early observers witnessed movements like this and didn't understand that the birds had just arrived. They imagined that they had actually been sleeping in the deep waters or underneath the ice for the entire winter. So this is one of the kind of great misunderstandings, that birds spend their winters underwater. It's ridiculous when we think about it now because we know so much better. But there have been plenty of other eccentric ideas over the centuries. One idea was that birds transform into other animals or other birds. And it's easy to see why they might have misinterpreted that. The European robin, for example, is quite common in Europe during the entire year. In the summer months, however, a closely related bird, the redstart, arrives. So this led to the misunderstanding that birds would change into other birds or even other animals during the seasonal changes. And while it's wrong, and while it's incorrect, it actually touches on the very beginnings of an understanding about molt and how birds change their appearance. One of my favorite anecdotes about migrating birds, or the arrival of birds or departure of birds, is that they fly to the moon. This was held for a very long time as a misbelief. And it's easy to see why early observers might have misinterpreted what they were seeing. Because many birds migrate at night. Routinely, they'll pass in front of the full moon, giving the impression to the uninformed observer that they're actually leaving the planet and flying to the moon as they depart for the winter or depart for the summer. Then came kind of an enlightened realization by this man, Colonel Montague, an English ornithologist. And he published a book called The Dictionary of British Birds, and the first edition in 1802 actually called out migration as something worth learning about. And he said, if all the migrative species did actually reside with us the whole year, whether in a torpid state or not, we should have daily productions of the fact. So what he's getting at here is that if in fact the swallows slept beneath the ice during the winter, well, certainly we would have found them. We would have dug them up. They would have gotten stuck in our nets or something like that. But of course, that never happened because this was a complete misunderstanding. But this simple statement here was kind of the beginning of a modern era of ornithology. Today, we understand migration through various techniques like the use of mist nets that are set up along corridors where migrating birds will fly into the nets, which they can't really see because they're so delicate. They get tangled there briefly while a researcher untangles them, extracts them from the net rather. And birds like this orange-crowned warbler are weighed, measured, examined, and finally a band is placed on the leg. That leg band has a unique number and a species identification so that if it's ever retrieved in the future, we'll be able to make note of that, and that information will go into a collective database. It gets to be even more technologically interesting when we start using radio telemetry, where radio transmitters are attached to these birds so that they can be monitored from a distance without capturing them in a net. And still another advancement is the MODIS tracking system, which is a series of antennae and receptors that are so small they can be attached to things like dragonflies to monitor their migration from one area to another. When an animal that's wearing a transmitter like this passes a tower like this one, it's immediately cataloged and documented in the database. So this is a little bit less manual of a tracking system, and it's showing great progress. It is, for example, one of the things that helps us understand the cliff swallow. Remember, this is the one that arrives and immediately starts building its mud nest. The cliff swallow now, through the various tracking techniques that I mentioned, we know that it's here during the summer, and we know that the yellow area is where it tends to pass through on its way farther north. The red always represents the spring and summer. The yellow is migration. But we know now that the birds actually spend their winter, that's the blue color, in South America. And it wouldn't be without this kind of technology and these techniques that we would fully understand this. But just from my point of view, I'm impressed with just the sheer length of this journey. From where I live in Mountain View, California, flying to Argentina is a 6,400-mile journey. And this happens twice a year. But for a bird that weighs 15 grams, which is just shy of 75 cents, and at a speed of 20 to 40 miles per hour, this and the flight time of roughly 10 hours per day, this means roughly 200 miles per day is covered by the cliff swallow as it makes that journey, either north or south, which translates into a month on the wing for that journey, which would take us a matter of hours in an airplane. This is just kind of a remarkable thing to think about for a moment. So this small bird weighing less than 75 cents would make this journey twice a year. There are prominent wildlife research organizations in the United States and elsewhere in the world. There are two local here in San Francisco Bay. There's the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory and there's Point Blue Conservation Science. Both of these organizations gather the data that I spoke about, and they help us understand it through their programs and through their publications. Their documentation fuels much research. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology is a fantastic science organization, and many of you know this already, a famous destination. It has a platform called eBird. eBird is a community science platform which allows us to access this information readily. So we can see the research that's been done on various birds like the cliff swallow and see their migration patterns and find out their schedule of presence in a given area. This is a wonderful site to go to. It's free and you can learn quite a bit just by browsing on it. But the real value of eBird is the mobile platform, which allows you to document your bird sightings anywhere you are in the world. So if you happen to be birding in San Francisco and you see a peregrine falcon flying overhead, chasing rock pigeons, or something more mundane like house sparrow, you can log that into the eBird platform, and that goes into the public database, which is in turn used by researchers and students worldwide. It is exactly what gives us this kind of animated map where we can see the cliff swallow migrating from south to north and back again. The darkness of color represents the density of birds. And of course, the month-to-month schedule on the mid portion of the right-hand panel shows you where the birds are during a given month. This is all so new and so wonderful. But we have got to wonder, why do birds migrate at all? Why do any of these creatures migrate? Much of it has to do with the availability of seasonal food. These tent worms, for example, tent caterpillars, for example, on the East Coast, they come in almost plague-like proportions, but they come on a schedule. Birds know this. They've learned when they can be found, and they feast on these enormous numbers of tent caterpillars. So seasonal food in the form of insects or vegetation like the coffee berry. Berry plants tend to produce fruits in the fall and winter, which of course attracts other birds and animals that know about this schedule and make use of it. Mating opportunities, of course, are a strong motivation to migrate. We see long-billed curlews and other animals that are migrating from one area to another, finding potential mates and diversifying the gene pool. They may be coming from completely different areas, but they meet in these breeding grounds and they start their families. And if you've never seen Clark's grebe doing their courtship dance, it is truly spectacular. This is a bird we have locally here in Santa Clara County, and there are birds that have these kinds of wonderful displays elsewhere in the world, probably where you live as well. Nest options. This is important because nests are at a premium. It's like a housing market. So these bank swallows, of course, make use of these burrows. These burrows sometimes take several seasons to excavate, so they're at a premium. The birds that arrive early can claim the best and the nicest burrows. The ones that arrive a little bit later might have to choose a nest that isn't quite right or isn't completely finished. So there's a real value in migrating and doing so on time. Even with things, birds that make cup nests, like this warbling vireo, there are certain branches that support a nest like this and others that don't. There are certain nest sites that have good cover from the sun and others that don't. So whether you're living in a cavity and laying eggs in the cavity in a woodpecker hole or a burrow, nest sites are at a premium. Birds often look for milder conditions when they migrate from one area to another. It's easy to imagine that a fly-catching species, an insectivore, would find almost no food here in this snowy environment, this cold, snowy environment. For that reason, insectivores tend to migrate to warmer climates during the breeding season. Likewise, there are many birds that rely on the availability of water for their nest sites and for their food. Clearly, this area is not going to support birds that require a wetland habitat. At least not this season. Perhaps when it floods again in the future, it'll be just perfect. It's always important to know where the fuel stops are. Just as you're making any road trip, you want to know where the rest stops are. But in this case, we're looking for food, not restrooms. Coastal mudflats in the San Francisco Bay host thousands and thousands of shorebirds. These are least sandpipers here looking for invertebrate food in the mud. And the adjacent ponds, all the old Cargill salt ponds, are closed and not tidal. They're quite saline, and they support lots of microscopic life and lots of food floating on the surface. Perfect for these Wilson's Phalaropes. Communal roosts are really important for migrating birds. There's safety in the numbers here, and we can find mixed flocks of marbled godwit, willet, and long-billed dowitcher, keeping close together, feeding side by side, not really competing by virtue of their different bill lengths and different structures. So massive amounts of feeding done in these common areas and the protective quality of a group. Agricultural lands, which we have so many of in California, host insect life and vegetable food. The fallow crops are perfect for sandhill cranes and geese that arrive during winter, finding lots of food there. And riparian corridors are always good stops for a migrating bird because of the availability of insects and fish in this watery environment. Flowering plants can be very useful for traveling birds. What's interesting about our eucalyptus, of course, introduced species, is they tend to flower in fall and winter. So birds that pass through on their way north or happen to overwinter in our area find a good source of food in the wintering flowering plants. So the flight paths are not all the same, obviously. We've got birds all over the world that are moving from one place to another. They're going to take different roads. And here's just an example of 4 of the flight paths that we see in North America for waterfowl. So the Central Flyway, the Mississippi Flyway, the Pacific Flyway, and the Atlantic Flyway. And you can see the density of little colored icons in given areas mean that that's an enormously useful stop for these birds. The Northern Central Valley in California, one of the greatest areas for waterfowl to gather. Some journeys may be only a few miles and others are pan-hemispheric. The redneck phalarope, I just learned recently, has a really interesting migratory path. This is an aquatic sandpiper. It's highly pelagic, liking the open water to migrate, which is unlike most shorebirds. The representatives of that species that live in the Shetland Islands off northern Scotland fly across the North Atlantic to eastern Canada before flying farther south across the Panama Canal, and then finally into the coastal waters off of Peru and the Galapagos. This is a really interesting journey. It's not quite intuitive, but it is exactly where those birds migrate to. This is due to what we call ancestral pathways. We'll learn a little bit more about that later. Certainly not all migratory routes are north-south. We've come to think of geese and ducks flying north or south, depending on the season. Well, that's often true, but not always. The harlequin duck, for example, breeds in the mountains of the Rockies and in Alaska, western Alaska. And you could see from the orange area where it breeds to the wintering area where it's blue, there's a strong east-west component here. So this sort of belies the understanding of north-south. Pigeon guillemot has a really completely unexpected migration. This is an alcid, a relative of the puffin, that breeds on our Central Pacific coast, Central California coast. So it breeds down on the Monterey Bay and areas close to the San Francisco Bay during the spring and summer, and in the winter, it flies north to the coastal Canada. This is really quite curious. This is exactly opposite what we expect. American Dipper is one of my favorites because its map makes it look as if it doesn't migrate at all. Purple, of course, is the combination of red, which represents spring and summer, and blue, which represents fall and winter. You combine those two colors and you get purple. And that's why this map looks entirely purple, because there's no real discernible seasonal difference between winter and spring for this bird. However, their habitat is alpine rivers, which flow up and down in many different directions. And the birds in the colder months move downstream to where the water is more fluid and they might find more food, returning upstream when those areas thaw and the food becomes available up there. So this altitudinal migration is quite a shocking thing that we've learned about. Rufous hummingbird, one of the most beautiful hummingbirds we have in North America, I think. And from its map, the yellow area represents the migration route where we expect it to pass through on its way someplace else. From western Mexico in the winter, pass through the western states in the United States, and then finally to Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and western Canada, where it breeds. But that journey is not straight up and down. It's actually a circular journey. The birds fly north along the coast, making use of our temperate climate here and the arrival of spring flowers. When they finally arrive to their breeding range in Canada and the northwest of the US, the flowers are in full bloom, and they make use of those flowers on their way south through the Rockies back to Mexico. Birds have the choice of flying over land or water. And for example, here's another hummingbird, the ruby-throated hummingbird. During the spring, where the urge to get to the breeding grounds is extremely urgent and extremely important that it arrive on time, it flies directly over the Gulf of Mexico, which is a perilous journey for a bird that is this small. On its way south, however, it's going to take a much more leisurely route that passes over the peninsula of Florida and through the islands down to Central America, or it'll come down along the Central Flyway, primarily over land. There's another example of a bird that has a different route north and south. The blackpoll warbler flies north the way one might expect it, kind of a straight point from northern South America through the islands up to Western Canada. But on its way south, it swings way out over the Atlantic, making another perilous journey far longer than the ruby-throated hummingbird over open water. And it does this partly because it's assisted by seasonal weather, which makes that journey actually possible. So how did migration evolve? This is one of the more interesting questions. And through the mists of time, Earth has had at least 5 ice ages. Many would argue that there are far more, but let's just stick with 5 for the moment. And ancestors of today's birds were undoubtedly affected by the changes in these conditions. There are 2 theories about how these birds responded to the changes in conditions with the ice ages and how migration evolved. One theory is what we call the northern home theory. And this states that the migratory species originated in the northern latitudes, and they fled the advancing ice in search of more suitable feeding areas farther to the south. That makes a lot of sense. Another theory is the southern home theory, which says that birds followed the receding ice to find abundant food that was revealed. So in one case, the birds' migratory species originated in the northern latitudes, and in the other theory, they originated in the southern latitudes, each responding to the advance or the receding of the ice. Most likely it was a combination of these 2 theories, and there are more than 10,000 species on the planet, many of which are migratory, so many possibilities there. And this response to the advancing or the fleeing from the ice was repeated century after century. And most importantly, that urge to relocate in search of resources became genetically ingrained in each of these species. And the seasonal available fuel stops were discovered and remembered by each species. And that's preserved the ancestral flyways we see today, much like the red-necked phalarope. Birds use a number of strategies to get from one place to another or to make these journeys possible. One is paying attention to the time of day, literally. So warmer, heavier air during the day is fine if a bird can soar or feed as it flies. This is especially true with some of our large hawks, like Swainson's hawk, which winters in Argentina and summers in the western United States. So it's a large bird with large wings and quite heavier than some of our smaller passerines. So it really relies on the rising warm air to buoy it up and have it give it altitude effortlessly, and then it'll spiral down and make progress many miles at a time without even flapping its wings. Because of this timing choice, this is the only way this bird could make this amazing long journey from Argentina. Other smaller birds migrate during the day, and they tend to be western kingbird and white-throated swift are both insectivores that are strong flyers and can feed as they make progress. And the merlin, a predator, also eats other birds. So all three of these birds find their food on the wing, and they can continue to make progress even after finding food. Land-bound birds feed during the day and travel at night when there are fewer predators around. Many of our smaller passerines are what we call land-bound. They feed on the ground or very close to the ground. They don't capture their food on the wing. They're quite vulnerable when they're feeding, but they have to feed during the day because that's only the time where they can find their food. So migrants like the black-chinned sparrow or the Wilson's warbler or the Bullock's oriole all migrate at night, whereas the hawks, the kingbirds, the swifts, falcons, they migrate during the day. Males, females, and juveniles often migrate at different times as well. Perfect example is our western tanager. This is quite common in the western United States. The males arrive first to establish their territories on the breeding ground. And when that's all set, the females arrive afterward, and then they mate. So the difference has its origin in different breeding strategies. For example, we've got the male and female tanagers. Outward appearance differences suggest different breeding strategies, suggest different nest duties. And these division of duties can lead to staggered migrations. What I mean by that is, here's the red-necked phalarope again. Red-necked phalaropes, all the phalaropes, for example, are interesting because the females actually are more colorful and dominant in the relationships than the males. So the female arrives first on the breeding grounds, sets up the territory, breeds with multiple males. The males then attend the nest, incubate the eggs, and it leaves the breeding grounds after the female. As soon as the female has laid her eggs and she's satisfied that she's got a number of nests and they're all active, she leaves the area, leaving the male to take care of the eggs. And it goes without saying, since the phalaropes are precocial species, the young can fairly quickly forage on their own, even before they can fly. So they will leave the nest site even after the males. So we have a three-stage migration for this bird, the red-necked phalarope. We see this also in common murres, where after fledging, the flightless chick will accompany the male for many months, feeding beside it. Even without the ability to fly, it migrates from one area to another simply by swimming on the surface. The female has long left. Seasonal weather. It's important to monitor this as a species. Changes in the photoperiod trigger hormonal response in the part of all birds. And that signals the birds that it's time to move, whether they're going north or south or east or west, what have you. This is called Zugenruhe. It's an undeniable urge to move. It's a restlessness that's been documented for centuries. Birds then take advantage of the predictable changes in weather, such as the black-poll warbler, which chooses to fly over water. It takes advantage of these wind or ocean currents and often alternates spring and fall flight paths like we saw with the rufous hummingbird. All of these things have to do with the interesting situation that our planet is tilted at 23.5 degrees. This is what brings about our various seasons. It's what preserves the seasonal wind patterns and currents. Everything is hung on this 23.5 degree tilt. But there's always the question of navigation. So now we know why birds want to move and why they move from one place to another, but how do they get there? How do they navigate? There are some interesting adaptations that many birds have. Small magnetic particles called magnetite are embedded in the bill of many birds, and this allows them to sense subtle changes in the magnetic field. Basically, it's an interior compass telling which way is north and which is south. Birds used constellations and the rotation of our night sky to orient themselves. This is so easy to understand. Early humans, of course, looked at the stars at night to know where they were and to guide their journeys. Birds do the same thing. Some birds even use low-frequency sounds and polarized light or smell to navigate between destinations. My favorite example of this are some of the seabirds, like the black-footed albatros, which has an incredible sense of smell. If you were to throw a fish carcass or dribble some fish oil onto the surface behind a boat, within minutes, if you're in range of black-footed albatros's sense of smell, you'll see it in a matter of minutes. From many miles away, it'll come running toward the boat or flying toward the boat. There's so many risks during the journey, of course. We've got severe weather with just like any flight on a commercial plane. Severe weather sometimes impacts departure time or arrival time. This is usually very temporary. Light pollution is extremely a large threat to migrating birds because of their need to be able to see the night sky. With excessive light at night, birds are not able to decode the patterns, the map they're seeing in the sky. Habitat fragmentation. Now, whether a bird is wintering in this location or summering in this location or breeding or simply passing through, is the habitat that it used the season before still here? Is it still intact? If it isn't, the habitat fragmentation, the habitat destruction is going to cause an interruption in the bird's pattern and possibly make it impossible for it to continue. Reflective glass. We've all seen pictures probably, or maybe even seen birds that have impacted glass. Oftentimes they get up and fly away after a moment's pause. Other times they don't. Reflective glass to a bird looks like sky or looks like a bank of trees. It doesn't see this hard obstacle. And if it flies fast enough, we can see literally thousands of dead birds beneath skyscrapers in large cities. Transmission lines pose a similar threat. They're invisible at night, of course. Birds impact this, and then, of course, they don't make it. Wind turbines. This is a delicate subject for an environmentalist to talk about because we all know the value of clean energy, but we also know the importance of clean energy appropriately placed. Certain areas are known flyways for birds of prey. Wind turbines that are not placed correctly or not timed correctly are responsible for the death of thousands of birds of prey, including eagles, osprey, red-tailed hawks, Swainson's hawks. So it's very important to put the wind turbines in the correct areas. And while this is probably one of the hottest and most divisive subjects, domestic cats pose an enormous threat to migrating birds, as well as residential birds. It was documented in the Washington Post recently that huge numbers, billions of birds are killed each year in North America by domestic cats. I don't have a solution for this, but it's important to know that this is a risk that we are dealing with. But there is perhaps no threat that's greater to migrating birds than the threat that we are all presented with, which is climate change. As the earth warms, we know that certain plants do not survive. Those certain plants support certain kinds of insects, which support certain kinds of food, which support certain kinds of birds. So as the earth warms, as the ranges of different plants and animals changes, the migratory pattern of birds may not, or may have to, but it may not be able to. So this poses an enormous threat, and many species are on the watch list as being the ones most deeply affected by climate change. One of our local birds, the Allen's hummingbird, is deeply influenced by the change in climate. There are some extreme cases of migration, which are fun to know about. Sooty shearwater is a very common worldwide seabird. And it gathers off of our California coast in the summer by the tens or even hundreds of thousands, flocks just beyond the surf, doing huge circles through Monterey Bay and Half Moon Bay, gathering in astonishing numbers that just blacken the water. They breed, however, in eastern Australia, New Zealand, various surrounding islands in South America. And their journey each year is 40,000 miles, doing huge paths across the Pacific and the Atlantic. What's interesting, though, is that their breeding in the southern hemisphere begins in September, whereas when they arrive in the north for the summer, it's actually their winter. So it's important to think about this situation because it basically demonstrates how global some of these creatures are and how global our interest in preserving habitat needs to be. Arctic tern, another famous example of long-distance migrants. Arctic tern essentially flies pole to pole, Arctic to Antarctic every year, back and forth every year. That's a journey of 25,000 minimum annually. Quite remarkable. And what's also interesting is that this species, Arctic tern, experiences more daylight hours than any animal on our planet. Because basically, it's always chasing the warmest, the highest part of the sun, from the breeding grounds in the Arctic to the wintering grounds in the Antarctic. That 23.5 degree tilt is responsible for these seasonal changes, of course. Bar-tailed Godwit. This story was not really understood until very, very recently. And I'm happy to say a friend of mine helped reveal the incredibly interesting migratory route that this bird has. So it breeds in Alaska, Northern Asia, and Europe. And it flies 8 days to New Zealand, a journey of 7,000 miles. So that's maybe a smaller distance than we've seen with the other birds. However, the bar-tailed godwit is not a seabird. It can't swim. It cannot land on the water. It has to remain in flight 24 hours a day for 8 complete days to make this journey of 7,000 miles from Alaska to New Zealand. This was so remarkable that no one expected it until it was proven with the use of radio telemetry and Modis tower technology. On its way back to the breeding grounds, it takes what seems to be a more reasonable journey through Eastern Asia. Of course, bar-tailed godwit once again reminds us how important it is to think globally when we're thinking about conservation and the preservation of these habitats. Which leads me to one of my final points is conservation. There is one bird, I think, that speaks more powerfully to the need for conservation than the red knot. The red knot times its journey northward to the breeding grounds in the Arctic with the arrival of horseshoe crab on the East Coast in May and June to breed. Depending on what latitude you're at, the horseshoe crabs may breed at slightly different schedule. When the horseshoe crabs arrive at their ancestral beaches and lay billions and billions and billions of eggs, these provide important fuel for shorebirds like the red knot here, and off to the right there's a dunlin as well. These fuel stops, during this time, the red knot may double its body weight. It's fattening up, strengthening itself for the continued journey to the Arctic. So we have here, the red knot relies on the horseshoe crab which in turn relies on its ancestral beaches, where it's been coming for millions of years to spawn. And finally, this is, I think, one of the strongest cases for habitat conservation, preservation of these areas that we know, and we have known for some time, are important fuel stops. So a way to think about it is, if red knot begins its journey north from South America, and it continues north all the way to the Arctic, at every stop along this journey, it has to be able to find food. And we as humans need to make sure that we make that food available to them. Otherwise, that species will not survive. Another interesting story is olive-sided flycatcher, which breeds in the boreal forest of Canada and the older growth forest of the United States western states. And it migrates through Mexico, Central America, and winters in Brazil and northern South America. So we know that the boreal forest in Canada is at risk, but it's really quite healthy. Logging is being done, but somewhat responsibly. Can we say the same thing about the forests in Brazil and the forests in northern South America, where deforestation is happening at an accelerated rate? The bird needs to have these forests preserved on both ends of its migration, because every stop on the bird's journey is connected to a next stop. If we sever a strand in this web, the whole thing will eventually collapse. It'll hold together briefly, but it'll collapse eventually. And we can't have that. We need to work to preserve these areas for the bird. So if you want to see migration around you, there are a few ways to do it. First thing I recommend is to pick up a checklist. Find a checklist for your area. These are available for county parks, state parks, national parks. They're available for counties and entire states. There are checklists for the entire continent. But a checklist can also be acquired from eBird. If you look at the bottom section here where it says bar charts, you can generate a checklist for a specific area, even your county. So going into there, you're going to produce something along these lines. This is a simplified version of our local checklist in Santa Clara County, and it demonstrates some interesting things. You see at the top, January through December, that's the month, of course. On the left, we see the birds' names, and in the middle, we've got these broken lines. These represent the abundance of a bird in a given season, given month. Common yellowthroat is common throughout the year. It's what we call a resident. These three warblers are migrants, but their patterns are not the same. The orange crown warbler is a common breeder for the entire breeding season. And a bird very similar to that might be barn swallow, which is something I would look for in Europe and in North America and elsewhere in the world. It's a perfect example of a bird that's present in a large area during the summer, but absent during winter. So getting back to this checklist, Wilson's warbler has a bump in numbers during the spring month. That suggests to me that there are massive numbers of Wilson's warblers that are simply passing through our area on their way farther north. And yellow warbler has exactly the opposite. There's a bump in the fall, meaning that the birds are still choosing to come through our area, but there are more of them. And I can't help but think that many of these new birds, these additional birds, are probably young birds flying through our area from areas to the north. Yellow-rumped warbler is a winter visitor here, and you can see that it's heavily present during the cold and winter and fall months, but it's almost completely absent during the warmer breeding months. So it breeds elsewhere. A perfect example of a bird like this in North America would be the white-crowned sparrow. It's a common wintering bird in most of our states. Only in northwestern US do we see it during the breeding season. And there are some purple areas in the high mountains, but for the most part, it's a winter bird in the United States and a summer bird in Canada. This is something you could probably look for where you live, if you're in the US. These are all expected patterns of seasonal abundance that change depending on where you are. So if you're viewing this from Spain or South Africa, the birds are all going to be different, but the qualities are the same. One interesting site to look at is birdcast.info, which is another Cornell sponsored website. You can enter a given area and it'll produce maps showing you how dense, how much activity is happening on a given evening, how much migration is happening on a given evening. And you can get very specific. You can enter a county in your area and see exactly how many birds passed over that county on a given night. And it'll tell you which birds are most likely to have been among those 306,000 birds that passed over on May 11th. And what about the rare birds? These are the vagrants. Black-burning warbler here is extremely rare, but it does seem to show up in the fall and winter. It's curious, and it's a really fascinating topic, but it's rather complex, and I think it would require more time to talk about. So until then, I want to alert you to a few resources that I'm really fond of. There's a wonderful book by Scott Wiedenthal called Living on the Wind. It's about migration between North and South America. It's beautifully written and extremely powerful read. How birds migrate is a kind of nuts and bolts description of some of the techniques and strategies that I outlined here. A World on the Wing, another Scott Wiedenthal book. This one takes more of a conservation slant on the topic of migration. So I can anticipate, this is a book I haven't read yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I anticipate that species like the red knot will be discussed here and the conservation issues that surround it. The two wonderful movies, which many of you have probably already seen, Wing and Migration is a wordless video about migration of many different species around the world. It's fascinating and beautiful, and it really does cover many of the same things I talked about today. March of the Penguins is about the emperor penguin alone and its journey to raise a family. Fascinating, remarkable filming. No matter where you are, you're probably going to need a field guide for your area. Again, South Africa, Europe, New York City, they all have unique field guides, but these two are really useful for the entire North American continent. The Sibley Guide to Birds and Birds of North America by National Geographic. Inside, you'll find maps, descriptions of the birds, illustrations of the birds, maps, quite wonderful. And for the hardcore readers, we've got two textbooks here, which really go deeply into migration, far deeper than I did, and talk about any number of physiological and behavioral characteristics of our birds. Two organizations I mentioned earlier, Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a wonderful site. eBird and its platform are extremely useful and interesting. They're both free. And I encourage you to visit our website, Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, scvas.org. And you're always welcome to contact me at any time with questions or comments about this presentation or anything else. And if you really liked what you saw today and you're interested in learning a little bit more, I encourage you to visit scvas.org/scvaslearn. This is where we have archived and upcoming classes, including this class, which are available. I'd like to give special thanks to Tom Gray, Stanford alum, for his wonderful photography. And I want to thank you all for being here today. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That presentation was just beautiful. The images really tell the story of the bird migrations. We have a couple questions in the Q&A. So I'll start with, in fallow cropland, what benefit do the birds bring?
What benefit do the birds bring? It's for the fallow crop fields for the sandhill cranes and the geese. Well, they're basically turning up the soil. They're also fertilizing the soil with their droppings. And it's probably not an entirely equal relationship. I think the birds might be getting a little bit more out of the availability of these fallow fields, but they definitely do create a benefit there by shifting up the soil and aerating the soil, in other words.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to tag in with some other questions for Matthew.
Mhm.
This one, I'm going to group a few together for you, Matthew. These are all related to climate change,
Mhm.
and so you can tackle them as a group or individually. Are you seeing migration changes due to climate change and the reduction of waterways? You alluded to this in the presentation. And can birds adjust, or do you expect a significant decrease in numbers?
Well, yes and no. So there have been very well documented changes in migration due to climate change. Um, One that comes to mind is locally we've had birds arrive earlier in the season because of the warming climate. The nest opportunities become available. They're experiencing the urge to move, the Zug and Ruhe. The issue is, so yes, changes have been occurring in bird schedules. They've also been lingering longer on the wintering grounds because of the warmer temperatures. But the real issue is they may change their arrival and departure dates. They may even change their breeding dates. They may start breeding earlier. But is the food that they require to support those nests and the production of eggs, is that available? So um, I expect that we may continue to see some changes in response to climate change, but I'm very worried about what will happen when it gets too far off of these, day to day or 1 week at a time changes, and it will happen. We'll see dramatic changes in the migration pattern, arrival and departure, which puts the birds completely out of sync with the foods that they've come to rely on. Water, yes, that's extremely important. And with our long time droughts, we're seeing areas that where plants that birds require are not thriving. They're not surviving, and that's very dangerous. So I'm hoping that answers the question.
Thank you. Our next question is, why do some birds migrate and others don't? Some seem to appear all year long.
Yeah, well, there are advantages to being in staying in an area um, as a resident. For one thing, you're not really tied to the breeding season that we think about. We think about spring being the time to breed. Well, we know that birds that are resident here, California towhee, Anna's hummingbird, they're here year round and they can breed whenever they want. So they can actually have multiple broods, and some of them are completely what we would think of as out of season. So there's a less urgency for a bird that doesn't migrate. There's the possibility of creating sort of a semi-permanent territory that can be defended, and birds will not be surprised because they're there all the time. They've been there the entire year. So I would say that yes, there's advantage to that, but there's also uh, disadvantage. The diet tends to be a little bit more consistent and not changing. Birds that migrate have a changing diet, and they've grown to accept that. They've evolved, I guess, to thrive on that.
Thank you so much. Another group question or grouping of questions. Is there a consensus on bird feeders and whether they are good or bad? And I have part two for the after you answer that one.
Um, I don't know of any Audubon society that doesn't have a feeder out front of its office. I know we do. We love the ability of bringing birds at close range so we can see them and admire them and notice their comings and goings. I think generally speaking, feeders they don't ever provide the sole source of food for birds. So I don't think there's much danger in having the food there for them as long as your feeders are clean, and especially if there's an outbreak of an avian pox or some sort of other disease that's traveling via the feeder. So I don't think there's much damage in feeders, but they have been shown to affect migration schedules for birds, particularly hummingbirds, and some of the birds like orioles that actually like visiting nectar feeders. So to a degree, I think there's a possibility that they can be damaging, but I think that's quite low chance of it being damaging. I think a far greater problem is what happens with the environment at large. And we do see changes in their schedules for sure, but none, I think, have been disruptive yet.
Very quick part two. For the past 3 years, if you happen to have seen, for example, rose-breasted grosbeaks at bird feeders for about 4 or 5 days, are those the same birds every year?
Very likely. It depends. If you see an immature bird one year, and the next year you see an adult, the same feeder and roughly the same schedule, I think that's quite likely to be the same one, especially here where we don't get a lot of rose-breasted grosbeaks. Elsewhere where they're more common, it's harder to say. But yes, birds live for several years. The larger the bird, the longer it lives. Small passerines like warblers and chickadees don't live terribly long, a few years. Larger birds like grosbeaks and jays can live, 8 to 10, 12 years. So the possibility that they're revisiting a place that they encountered the year before is quite high.
Great, thank you. And this will be our last question. I know sometimes migrating birds end up off course in unexpected places. What happens to these birds? Do they end up migrating back to the right spot, or are they forever lost?
I wish I had a happy ending to that question. Vagrancy, like I said, is one of the most complicated and wonderful topics, I think, in migration. And I think sometimes birds do survive. It depends on where they're being found. Birds that fly offshore, like songbirds that end up 50 miles offshore, are not likely to survive. A passerine, a songbird that makes it to California from Asia, it's possible it might survive. And we know that this sometimes happens because occasionally they return the following year, which suggests that a bird that might have arrived from Asia in California survived the off season, returned home, and came back afterward. So, of course, I have no way of proving that, and their vagrants are rare, of course, so there are not a huge number that have been banded or monitored in that way. I think probably evidence would show that many of them are not making it, but some of them are. Some of the larger vagrant birds, like the ruff or curlew sandpiper or other birds like that, shorebirds, famously long-distance migrants, and they have appeared year after year in certain areas. And that seems very likely to be the same individuals, quite possibly having returned to where they originated and then back here to be discovered again the following year.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Matthew, for that wonderful presentation on bird migration. In the chat, everyone is saying thank you. They really enjoyed this last hour with you. Hopefully everyone attending today will walk away looking at birds with a new perspective. We appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. And as part of the Continuing Studies mission to share educational resources with the community, we thank you all for joining us today. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.